In Conversation with Terry Shepard, award-winning broadcaster, narrator, and author. A deep dive into the writer's craft with the artists and support systems who create the stories we love.
Thanks, Lisa. Joe Kraus has been a professor at the University of Scranton since 2004. He earned his BA from the University of Michigan, an MA from Columbia, and a PhD from Northwestern. He is an historian of Jewish gangster lore whose research and writing focuses on Chicago's Jewish history. He is the author of the fascinating book, The Kosher Capones, A History of Chicago's Jewish Gangsters, the long-ignored story of the syndicate's Jewish wing. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Kosher Capones read to me like a mystery thriller. How did your journey into the past begin?
My mother came to me, and she had a copy of a book called The Joker is Wild, which was a biography of most famous is a Vegas stand-up comic, a guy named Joe E. Louis. And there's a passage in the biography of Joe E. Louis that describes how horrible Chicago was, because Louis himself was beaten up, mutilated by the syndicate. So my mother said she was reading this passage that described to indicate why it wasn't that extraordinary that Louis had been beaten up and cut and had acid poured on his face as it had been by a Capone gunner named Machine Gun Jack McGurn. And I often say, if you take nothing else from all my research, just never pick a fight with a guy whose first name is Machine Gun. I figure that's advice we can all use. But so my mother said to me, there's this little description, and it talks about how in the one paragraph in the Cone biography about how two brothers, Maxie and Davy Miller, were walking in downtown Chicago. They literally walked out of a theater, and a guy named Dean O'Banion walks up to them, puts guns in both of their stomachs, and pulls the triggers. And there's very little information beyond that in the book. And I should add, the book was a pretty impressive seller. It was made into a movie starring Frank Sinatra and Mitzi Gaynor. So this was not a low-profile thing. It was there. That's how I began. I thought, this is. So my mother said to me, Maxie Miller was my father, and my uncle's name was Davy Miller. And she literally hands the book to me and says, Joey, is this how my father died? So it really began what turned into a 30-year experience researching to figure out this story that we had so dramatically forgotten as much as anything else. So in the course of a single generation, because in fact, the Cone paperback gets it backwards. And it's Davy Miller who was shot, not Maxie Miller, as the book had said. But Maxie died a couple of years soon after, so that's why there's probably some confusion with that. But I was able to uncover that pretty quickly. It meant diving into archived newspapers in the Chicago Public Library. But one thread led to another. Like, what were they doing there? Why were they shot? Why did O'Banion want to get them? Who was O'Banion? Who were O'Banion's other enemies? What happened on the several other occasions that one or another of these Miller brothers was involved in organized crime? And it just gradually grew like a spider web to an obsessive, I'm somebody who's inclined toward research and the whole picture, and it just kept going and going. And eventually, it never ends. Since the book has come out, people have said, hey, you got this wrong, you might follow this pursuit. And I'm even aware that there's a huge chunk of the Chicago Jewish gangster that I never got into, which is mostly the Jews that were actually a part of the syndicate. And a smaller chunk, the Jews who were part of the North Side operation. I think that's a pretty fascinating story too. But that's where it started. And as you can tell, it really hasn't even ended yet.
Give us some biographical sketches of some of the cast of the Kosher Capones.
Zuki, the bookie Zuckerman. I find him a fascinating character. And I think my guess is if you lived in the Jewish Lawndale, the west side, the most densely Jewish part of Chicago, in the late 1930s, early 1940s, you'd absolutely know who he was. Zuki, just one of those names. He came to be the official owner, at least the understood owner. I don't know if he owned it on paper, but he owned what they call it the R&K restaurant at the time. It initially had been called the M&E restaurant, which is the Miller and Edelstein restaurant, which was really my great uncle's restaurant that Zuckerman took over. And it was a strange, this is part of the sketching of him as well, to clarify, that the place he owned, he took over from my great uncle, which was a kind of perverse community center in Jewish Lawndale. So it had a restaurant, which I gather the food was at least edible. Then it also had a boxing gym, which seems incongruous. And I can't imagine what it must have looked like on the inside. And There aren't any pictures that I've ever found, although I do have a couple of bricks. I was able to get there after they demolished the building. And then upstairs, most notoriously, it had gambling halls. And I, in fact, have some incredible firsthand accounts. The Chicago Crime Commission would send its agents into this restaurant, and there'd be guys who'd be there writing down, I saw so-and-so and so here. The gambling seems to be going on upstairs. I'm in the downstairs eating. So there's a lot of verbal, but not visual reports on that. That's who Zucchi was professionally. He owned this facility. He went around. I have only one picture of him with this sort of, he was a small man who wore a very wide tie, and his cap, his hat is jauntily askew. He doesn't look like he had a great sense of humor, but I think he probably was very full of himself as a kind of swaggering tough guy. And he essentially ran the place. As a young man, he was really violent. He was involved in at least one shooting. Actually, of a Northwestern football player who may or may not have been involved in fixing a game. It's an ugly incident, but the young man was killed after a traffic accident with those two, with Zucchi and his close partner. So I wish I could say more about his personality. The novelist in me wants to go and keep spinning it. But in terms of a capsule biography, that's who Zuckerman was. This figure who was both legitimate and illegitimate, spanning a line, more, in his case, more illegitimate than legitimate. He had some legal holdings, but he was very clearly a gangster. And just by way of contrast, if you'd like another capsule, there's a man named Jack Arvey, who's an important figure at that time. I see you nodding. If you know your Chicago history, or particularly Chicago Jewish history, he's a hugely important figure, probably the most important Jewish politician in Chicago before World War II. For the first 50 years of the 20th century, he's the most important figure. Among other things, in his sort of national exposure, he directed the Democratic Party that was able to really bring forward FDR. It's obviously a state-by-state coalition, but Illinois is crucial in that larger coalition, and Arvey is a central figure in all of that. So he's primarily a legitimate legal figure who knows these illegal kinds of figures. Now, he and Zuckerman weren't directly connected, but there are definite clear evidence of their being together. That's just two very quick profiles, but one is essentially an illegal gangster who's got some legitimate operations. One is very much a legitimate political figure who's got, I'll say, half a foot in the gangster world. At least he's able to work with them. And it's that kind of a strange coalition that moves forward a lot of how the politics and crime hand in hand of that era.
Dr. Joe Kraus is our guest. His book is The Kosher Capones, A History of Chicago's Jewish Gangsters. He teaches creative writing and American literature at the University of Scranton. Tell us about another character from the story, Lenny Patrick.
So Lenny Patrick, despite the name, is Jewish. It's not a very Jewish-sounding name. He's actually not born in the United States, but in Great Britain. So you wouldn't expect that kind of a background. But he arrives in Jewish Chicago when he's just a baby, an infant, maybe 3 or 4 years old. And he grows up in a family that's pretty rough and tumble to start with. One of the things I was able to discover that I thought was pretty interesting is that one of his uncles was involved in some of the violence of the early 20s. So Lenny himself, as a fairly young man in the early 1930s, decides he's going to give it a shot, literally. So he hooks up with a former Prohibition figure, not an Irish character, and they decide to start robbing banks in Indiana. Now, that might sound an odd move, but if you want to think about the larger context of it, it's the early 1930s, and Prohibition is about to end. So what you have is an illegal industry that has been able to support a number of criminals that is coming to an end. It's no longer going to be a viable business operation. So a lot of these people look to other kinds of opportunities, and desperado is part of what follows from that. And so they go and they try to rob some banks in Indiana, which is probably not a good idea under any circumstances, but especially if you're someone who's grown up in the city and you have no idea how to navigate northeastern Indiana. So they're literally busted, like running through the woods. And Lenny gets sent to prison for 8 or 10 years. So he misses this transition from a world of the gangster, the late Prohibition era, into what really becomes a kind of established syndicate space by the early 40s, right? It's about a 6-7 year window. Prohibition ends, and there's a lot of shakeout. A lot of people are involved in crime or killed. There's a range of consolidation, which is never pretty in the business world. It's even uglier in the gangster world, right? People literally are killed. That's how you get rid of your competition. So when he comes back, he's hungry and he's angry. He's missed out on all of this. And there's some early mentions of him in the early 40s as basically running a craps game on the street in front of the restaurant that Zuckerman owns, then Zucki the bookie owns. Formerly, of course, it was Davy Miller's. So it's the corner of Roosevelt and Kedzie. It's the main intersection of Jewish Lawndale. And he wants it. He's a hungry guy. He's Jewish. He's there. He feels, again, I'm extrapolating a little bit, but we have a lot of him. We have a lot of his testimony. So I've heard his voice a lot, at least on paper. I've seen his exact words repeatedly. And he wants what he feels he didn't have a shot at. And so it becomes clear that Zucki and his partners want to keep doing things the way they've always done them. And yet the larger syndicate doesn't want to play that game. So there's pretty strong evidence that for many years, the Zucki and his crew paid roughly 25% of their gambling take to the larger syndicate. And then it got left alone. The metaphor I always use is it's like they owned an Ace Hardware store. They had their own franchise. It was theirs. They ran it. They paid up, and they paid up the ladder to the higher ups, and the rest was on their own. Zuckerman agreed to become a tool of the syndicate. And with his eventual partner, a guy named Davy Yaris, also Jewish, they killed Zucki, almost certainly. That's not 100%, but it's almost certain they were the trigger people. They then killed Zucki's remaining partners, and next thing you knew, they were the bosses. And they actually did not make their headquarters in the R&K restaurant, but they went down the street a block to California, literally half a mile, California and Roosevelt, and they called it the Lawndale Restaurant. And the building is still there. It's a stunning building. Even before I realized it was his, and when I drove past, I would always be struck how beautiful it is. But it was another restaurant, I called it earlier, perverse community center. And from 1945, 6, 7 until the early 60s, that's where it was all centered. But Jewish Lawndale began to deteriorate. The Jews tended to move away. You certainly have, in the wake of Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, you have much of that part of the city is subject to riots. Buildings are burned down. Businesses close. So in a very rapid moment, Jewish Lawndale evaporates. But Lenny is still the guy who's the go-between for this smaller time. There's always a lot of bookie action. I'm not going to say Jews bet more than anybody else, but they bet plenty, right? And gambling is the biggest source of all of this. There's some extortion. That becomes bigger for Lenny Patrick later on, especially after the Illinois lottery gets started. It puts a lot of the bookie business out. The FBI gets a little more alert to what's going on. But in essence, Lenny Patrick reflects the distribution of Jewish Chicago. So he relocates essentially from West Side Jewish Lawndale to North Side Jewish Rogers Park. And Rogers Park is not as densely Jewish, but it's got a pretty substantial Jewish population. And he continues to be a factor in all this throughout the 60s, into the early 70s, and staggeringly into the early 80s, while still a figure in all of this, a diminished figure, ever diminished, he then winds up being pressured by the FBI into turning state's evidence against some of the remaining major figures in the Italian-American syndicate.
The book is The Kosher Capones. Our guest is Dr. Joe Kraus. What was the organization of the syndicate like back in those days?
Before Prohibition, it's a bunch of different gangs, right? Everybody, you control this part of the street, that part of the street. Mostly at that time, of course, it's gambling. It's also what they call racketeering at a small level at that point. And that's a kind of, racketeering is essentially extortion at a higher level. So it's extortion if I say, pay me not to throw my rock through your window. Racketeering is to say, listen, if you join my association of distributors or manufacturers, we'll make sure no one throws a rock through your window. And they get to be more and more complicated. But those are the elements that are out there. And then Prohibition comes along. And there is so much money that for a brief window from 1919 to 1922, people are making fortunes overnight. They're killing each other. It's back and forth. Around 1922, 23, 24, you get a kind of cooperation, coordination. And the guys who are making money say, this is silly. Why are we fighting each other? Let's cooperate. So you have this level of cooperation. But what happens is the most important gang in this cooperative is headed at the time by a guy named Johnny Torrio, but eventually by Al Capone. And they become the biggest figure in this group. And the way I like to tell the story is it's a gradual consolidation that takes place with one abrupt incident or set of incidents in the middle, because the second largest gang in this cooperative, the North Side Gang, headed originally by this Dean O'Banion, who shot my grandfather and great uncle, and at the end, really by a guy named Bugs Moran, who many people are going to know. That North Side Gang said, to hell with this. We're tired of being the junior partners in this larger operation. We want a bigger cut. And they began about a 3 or 4 year war back and forth. That's where the Tommy guns come out. That's where Chicago Bang comes from, all the legends of the gangster fights. And of course, it culminates in, or climaxes in, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, which doesn't entirely wipe out the North Side Gang. It wipes out a certain elements of the North Side Gang, the remainder of which join back in with the syndicate. And the ones that do that make that sort of subsequent peace, are actually disproportionately Jewish, is part of what I'm finding in my research. So at that point, this is when Zuckerman and those guys come in. You've got a cooperative group, but everybody's cooperating at the end of a gun. So it was always violent, and it becomes, I like to say, they go from Tommy guns to silencers. And they're still shooting, they're still killing back and forth. And Zuckerman is shot at close range in his front yard, which is awful, brutal killing, with children watching in the street. That's how it all comes down. But by Zuckerman's time, the syndicate is basically saying, you know, all those allies we had 10, 15 years ago, time for you to go. We're going to consolidate, we're going to pull it together. So gradually, what was the syndicate becomes, in Chicago parlance, the outfit, which is a kind of quieter, I love the sinister quality of that name. And so that's Zuckerman's death is one of the important elements, one of the important points in the transition from syndicate to outfit.
We're in conversation with Joe Kraus. His fascinating book is The Kosher Capones, A History of Chicago's Jewish Gangsters. His grandfather and great uncles, the notorious Miller brothers of the Jewish West Side, were among Chicago's early gangsters. Joe, give us the setup that led to the front yard shooting. How did things get sideways between Patrick and Zucky?
Patrick is just the gun. The challenge is with the higher ups. Probably Jack Guzik would have been a part of that. Murray Humphreys a part of that. Just emerging would be Paul Ricca and Tony Accardo, some of the names who really governed the syndicate itself. So that's where the issue comes in. As early as 1943, there's the guy who runs West Side Chicago behind the scenes. He's got one of the great nicknames. It's Julius Love and Putty Annixter, but they pronounce it Putty Annixter, and I've seen it. I've heard that. Old timers told me this, but I found a wonderful AP article that actually misspells it as P-U-D-Y, Putty, as opposed to Love and Putty. But the idea is that he was such a manipulator in terms of the way he talked with you that you were like putty in his hands. He was like loving putty. But Putty Annixter is the guy who really he's the first, even before my great uncle, he's the one who pioneers Jewish Lawndale in a kind of shady fashion. And he's someone who's very much a part of this cooperative arrangement. He's one fixture in all of it. He's actually a part of, his allegiance seems to be more closely tied to the North Side Gang. He's one of those guys who, in the wake of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, says, who the hell needs that? By around 1943, he dies. Natural causes, believe it or not. But his death makes it then easier, as I understand it, for the syndicate to say, okay, new arrangement, new deal. And they go to Zuckerman, who expects to be inheriting this whole operation. He's always been the kind of public face of it, the right-hand man. Again, if not the legal owner of the restaurant, the guy you see when you walk in the restaurant. So there's that difference. Whereas Putty you might never see. Like there were some terrific stories about how in the early to mid-20s, when the police would do these vast raids of all the West Side gambling clubs. And the newspaper would even say, yeah, we got them all except the big fish Putty got away. He wasn't there. We can't prove it. We know he's responsible, but he got tipped off. So this is who he was. With his death, it really weakens the political power of Zuckerman. And so the mob, the syndicate says to him, 25%, that's how we used to do it. Now it's 50%. And Zuckerman says, hell no. And he pushes back. And there's a lot of resistance back and forth, how much he's willing to pay. Obviously, I'm not privy to those negotiations. We just see the kind of outline of it. So I don't think it takes a novelist to say there was probably some attempt at negotiation of some kind. But at a certain point, that was it. And so there's actually a wiretap conversation with the man who succeeded Jack Arvey, at least temporarily, as the alderman of Chicago's West Side, a guy named Arthur X. Elrod. Originally, his name was Axelrod. He anglicized it by going from Axelrod to Elrod, but he kept the middle initial X. So Arthur X. Elrod, crazy little details like that. And Elrod, apparently under being wiretapped, said finally, to hell with it, I wash my hands. And that's soon thereafter, we know that Zuckerman was killed.
Joe Kraus is our guest. The book is The Kosher Capones. What has been the reaction inside and outside of the Jewish community to this book?
I've been really pleased. I'm so flattered that you would reach out and speak to me. And I've been not entirely surprised, but it's been the upper level of what I could have hoped for in terms of how often I get asked to speak about this. When the book first came out, I was all excited. It sold a bunch of copies right away. I mean, that's not enough to get rich or anything remotely like that, but it was exciting. And I said, I'm going to take all of the money all of my royalties, which were still not substantial. But it was enough that I could buy myself about 70 or 80 copies of the book, because I was planning I was going to just go try and do a mini book tour, like an independent musician. I was going to go to various places and schlep my books and try and sell a few here and there.
Joe Kraus wrote The Kosher Capones, a history of Chicago's Jewish gangsters. Available in digital, paperback, hardcover, and audiobook, wherever cool books are sold. Great conversation, Joe. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you so much. What a joy. What a pleasure to talk with you. Thank you.
In Conversation with Terry Shepard is a copyrighted presentation. All rights reserved. I'm Lisa Davis. Join Terry Shepard next time in Conversation.